Hello, thank you for joining us. User research is all about helping us understand people so that we can build better experiences that meet everyone's needs. But let's be honest, historically that word people has been a pretty narrow slice of the pie. We're usually talking about non-disabled users, people with fast internet connections or the latest devices, people who are digital natives, and often those without any identified access needs. So here's something to think about. Over a quarter of individuals live with a disability, yet that group is largely missing from our research studies. And when they're not represented in our research, their needs aren't addressed in the products that we create. I'm Elle Waters, an Accessibility Customer Manager here at Workday. I'm joined today by my teammate, Purva Sane, and we'll also hear from one of our researchers, Marcy Tate-Lamar. Today we're going to talk about what inclusive user research is, why it matters, and how you can get started with a few practical steps. By the time we wrap up, I hope you'll have what you need to make this arguably the most impactful UX investment you can make, a regular part of your design and development process. So let's jump right in. Purva, you've spent a lot of time thinking about what this actually means in practice. So help us understand, what are we even talking about when we say inclusive user research?
Yes, absolutely. Inclusive user research is the practice of intentionally including people in research who have been traditionally ignored or misrepresented. So people with disabilities, people who have different lived experiences from the researchers who are doing the studies. It starts by simply acknowledging that the average or standard user does not exist. Instead of designing for the mythical average user, we need to invite different perspectives, different lived experiences into our research process. We need to make a point to reach out to people of different ethnicities, different ages, different abilities, different socioeconomic backgrounds. Let's stop making assumptions about what our users want or need, which are often biased on the experiences and expectations that we as UX practitioners have. We need to center the experience, the lived experience of disabled user and make them part of our research. Now, I also want to use this opportunity to clarify certain misconceptions about inclusive research. Inclusive research is not the same thing as accessibility compliance or accessibility auditing. Accessibility standards and meeting them is the minimum bar. Inclusive research goes beyond that. Where accessibility compliance asks, can a user use this? Inclusive research asks, do they feel represented by this product? Do they feel like they are respected by the product? The second misconception about user research is that it's a checkbox in a checklist that you do just before launch. That's not really inclusive research. That's just checking the checkbox. Inclusive research is a continuous mindset. It's something that you should be doing from day one of your product for every single phase, whether it's design or whether it's development or whether it's testing. The third misconception is that inclusive research is edge case research. We often hear that marginalized people are referred to as edge cases. We really need to shift that. Inclusive research is not edge case research. Solving for the most excluded, the most underrepresented groups is always going to result in a better user experience for everyone who's using that product. In short, if your data doesn't include diverse perspectives, your data is incomplete, and we cannot make sound design decisions based on incomplete data. So, Elle, you have actually spent a lot of time in the industry. Can you share what are some myths that you've heard people use to push back on inclusive research?
Yes, I would love to. Probably the first one that comes to mind is that inclusive research is something that you can only do when you have a fully functional product. And that's just not true. There's a ton of insight that you can gain at each stage of the product lifecycle with different user groups, with different fidelity of things. The second myth that I've heard so often is that inclusive research is too costly, or that it's too time consuming, or that it's a nice to have, but not absolutely essential to the work that you're doing. And I would flip that entirely. I would say that the cost of not doing inclusive research is a poor user experience, you have rework, and possibly some legal exposure. And so that is far greater of a risk and much more investment that you have to make after a product is done than if you made it up front. And the third myth that I hear so much is that you would learn the same things with a research study with participants with disabilities as you would with a traditional study. And that's just simply not true. Dollar for dollar, you learn things from participants with disabilities that you would never gain in a traditional user research study. So these myths are really based in fear or a lack of awareness. But let's go a little bit deeper, Purva. Why should we do inclusive user research?
So there's this phrase in the disability rights movement that I keep coming back to, nothing about us without us. Basically, what it means is that when you're designing or building something for a certain population, whether that's someone with a disability or whether that's users who are from a different socioeconomic background, you invite them into the room instead of guessing and theorizing about what their needs are. Bring them into the conversation, ask them what their needs are. And beyond just ethics, inclusive research actually drives innovation. There is this thing known as the curb cut effect, where when you're designing something with the needs of a certain population in mind, you end up creating something better for everyone to use. So the curb cuts that were initially designed for wheelchair users benefit more than just that group of people. You have a mom with a stroller or somebody on a bike or a 20-year-old trying to get to class on an electric scooter. Everybody's able to use that feature that was designed for somebody with a disability to use. And I'm going to be really candid. The very last thing is it's about de-risking. We've all seen the stories about like a product was built and launched and it caused significant harm or had a lot of missed requirements for a certain user group, and that leads to legal risk, reputational risk. So inclusive research is just avoiding that risk and bringing you to the certainty that what you're building is actually going to work for the real world, for the real people who will be using your product. And actually, I want to hear from someone who lives this every day. Marcy Tate Lamar is one of our researchers at Workday, and she's the person in the room where the real work happens. We asked Marcy what it looks like when these research findings are included in product implementation. Here's what she had to say.
So when I think about inclusive research done well, the tell really isn't just in the report, it's in the room. So it's the moment a participant stops performing for us and starts to teach us, because we're actually building or have built a session that works for how they work. So their assistive tech is set up before they arrive. We're not rushing them through a script. We're comfortable with silence and pauses. And when something in our prototype doesn't work for them, we treat that more as a signal than as a session going sideways or something going wrong. So the other thing that I would say, and I think that this is a part that people underestimate a lot, is that inclusive research done well changes the researcher too. That dynamic is symbiotic. You stop asking, did the user complete the task? And you really start asking, what did this person just teach me about an assumption that I didn't know what I was making? For an example, like I more recently did some on-site research for a voice modality that we are trying to build. And I was walking through this back room with one of the workers, and we were talking about the experience, we were talking about the modality. And at one point, the person said to me, actually, I probably wouldn't use this. I have a speech difference. I have a lisp. I don't think it would actually accurately work for me. And that was really not something that I had thought about and in my approach to this research. And it really illuminated for me there's a totally different experience that we need to account for when we're talking about language parity or language access and using different kinds of features. So that shift from testing people or um, doing a user interview with people really shifts to learning from them, and that's what it looks like when it's working.
I think that Marcy hit on exactly the kind of thing that makes this real. This is why inclusive research matters. So let's talk a little bit about numbers next. Elle, you've spent a lot of time looking into the numbers and the data behind why inclusive research is important and how do you make the business case for inclusive research. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I would love to. I think this is an area that people don't explore nearly enough, that there is a real return on investment for accessibility. So let's look at some numbers. We're talking about a $13 trillion market, the global spending power of people with disabilities and their networks. And that's not marginal, that's a massive underserved market. And the ROI data backs this up too. Forrester Research has done analysis on the dollar for dollar return on inclusive design and centering the disabled user experience, and those numbers are really strong. Disability is mainstream, and that's something that people aren't always thinking about. The CDC says more than 1 in 4 U.S. adults, that's 28.7%, have some type of disability. And inclusion correlates with a stronger business performance. In Accenture's analysis of over 346 U.S. companies, firms leading on disability inclusion saw more revenue, more net income, more economic profit, and these companies were 25% more likely to outperform peers in productivity. So leaders are seeing accessibility as a growth lever. Forrester found that 60% of global design professionals said their executives have mandated accessible experiences, and that the top drivers were to win new customers, create better experiences for all customers, and attract and retain talent. Of course, there's also the cost of not doing this. In 2024 alone, there were over 4,000 lawsuits related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's legal risk, reputational risk, and remediation cost, all of which dwarf the investment in getting it right the first time. The business case isn't just ethical, it's financial. And the organizations that recognize that early have a real competitive advantage. We've talked about what it is and why it matters and what the stakes are. So Purva, take us through what this actually looks like to implement.
So this is my favorite part because this is where it gets real. To include inclusive research into your research process, I like to think of it into 4 different pillars. The first pillar is recruitment. We have to stop relying solely on generic panels. If you keep fishing in the same pond, you'll catch the same fish. We need to actively partner with disability advocacy organizations because these groups have deep knowledge and lived experience that can inform our research. They're a trusted pathway to recruit diverse participants, and they ensure that our samples are actually representative. But here's the practical to-do item. You need a dedicated budget line for this. Specialist recruitment takes more time, so your incentive rates need to reflect that. We're not just paying for time, we're paying for specialized lived experience. The second pillar is study setup. Whether you're remote or in person, accessibility cannot be an afterthought. This means creating an accessibility checklist for every session. Before a participant joins your session, you should know: is their assistive technology compatible with your software? Is the lighting okay for someone who lip reads? Is the noise level managed for someone with sensory sensitivities? Build the environment around the human, not the other way around. The third pillar is moderation. Researchers need to have training to be flexible with the pace and with the communication methods. If a participant is using an AAC device, an augmentative and alternative communication device, the cadence of the conversation is going to be different. Researchers need to be comfortable with silence. They need to be comfortable troubleshooting technical issues without making the participant feel like a problem to be solved. The fourth and final pillar is synthesis and reporting. This is where a lot of organizations fall short. Insights from inclusive research should not be a side note in the appendix. They need to be integrated into your core metrics. When you're presenting to stakeholders, put accessibility insights right alongside your usability scores. And when you are writing your research report, ask yourself, if the participant read this, would they feel like their expertise was captured, or would they feel like just a data point? Bring back that principle, nothing about us without us, all the way through to how you document and share what you have learned. And then there is what I like to call the last mile in the research process, going from insight to impact. When you're doing an inclusive user research study, those insights can't just live in a PDF somewhere and then be forgotten about. You need to have integrated backlogs. You need to take your insights from your research study and actually feed them into the engineering sprint so that they actually get built and put into the product. We also need to build empathy through exposure. Invite your developers and product managers to watch a user research session. When they see a user actually struggling with the thing that they built, accessibility goes from being a task that they have to do to an actual human problem that they need to solve. And then you also need to measure the outcome. Once you have implemented something with insights from inclusive research, did your support tickets go down? Did your time on task improve? Did you get better conversion for a specific demographic? All of these metrics, when you track them, they not only show the success for your current project, but they also build the case for future inclusive research studies. Research doesn't end when the report is written. It ends when you actually take the insights from your research and put it into the product and make the user experience better for everyone. Researchers like Marcy have seen what happens when this loop actually gets closed. When research doesn't just sit in a report but actually moves something. Marcy shared what that looks like from her vantage point.
Okay, so this is a part that I really care about. The clearest sign to me that the loop is closed, at least from where I sit, is when people who build the product, who are part of designing the product, start asking questions before I do. So my PM pulls me in early because they want to know who we're missing, who we're not hearing from. A designer watches a session and wants to make that edit because they've heard someone say, this is actually not going to work for me. I have color blindness. An engineer watches one session and then they reach out to me because there's an accessibility fix they want to add to their backlog. That is the loop closing. When that insight doesn't need me to carry it because the right people are watching and taking that initiative to carry things forward.
That's a perfect place to land before we wrap up. What Marcy described is the proof of concept. This works and the impact is real. We've covered a lot of ground today. What's the one thing that you'd like for people to take away from this and actually do?
Yeah, so Elle, I always come back to the phrase, nothing about us without us. I want to invite everyone here to ask, who is missing from this conversation? And then include them in the research for your next project. Don't wait for everything to line up perfectly. Start by being humble and curious and listening to the people who haven't been a part of the discussion.
My one thing would be go find one study on your roadmap next quarter, 2 quarters from now, just one, and change one thing about how you're running it. So that could be add a screener question. It could be instead of defaulting to your usual panel, think about recruitment somewhere else where you might be able to screen for somebody with an experience that you haven't really thought about before, haven't really included before. Maybe sit with a teammate or a colleague and rewrite your screener so you're not accidentally filtering people out. Just one of those things can make a real difference and really highlight the lived experience of people with disabilities and actually shed more light on the problem space that you might be entering and trying to solve for. So that would be my one thing.
Wonderful. Yes. For me, I think it's this. The return on investment is real and the logistics are manageable. So thank you, Purva and Marcy, and to everyone here who joined us today. This is exactly the kind of conversation that moves things forward. We're going to open it up now for questions, so let's keep that discussion going.